Hey everyone, so this time we are talking about variables. So variables are very important and they're very useful, and they actually they're like the basic building blocks of programming. So variables are any time that you ever want to store a value. So you want to keep a value throughout your code, and then actually, variables are something you can build on. So we talked about them being like a box that you can put values into and just hold on to that for later, and then you can actually name the box. That way you know what's inside of it. But the cool thing is with variables is you can actually edit them as your program goes along. So variables can actually change their value by adding more value to them, adding more letters to them. So just things like that. So they're very useful, and it's very important to kind of know how to use them. So in Python, there are several different types of variables. This is not all of them, but this is most of them. So the first one we have is called an integer variable, and it's going to hold any number that does not have decimal places. The second type is called a float variable, and that's any value that has decimal places, so like pi, for example. You may also hear this referred to as a double. It's called a double in a lot of different programming languages. A char variable, which is just a short for character, so it's any one character on your keyboard surrounded by quotation marks. A string variable is going to be any collection of letters or numbers inside of quotation marks. So remember, strings are very different than, even if they're numbers, if they're inside quotation marks, you're actually talking about the character rather than the value. And then Boolean is going to be either true or false. You can only have two variables. So you'll notice the variable names that I have actually describe what the variables are. All right, so that's very important, and I'll talk about that. So naming your variables is an important skill. Is an important skill to have as a programmer. You want to name your variables to where you can look at the name and know what it is. So it wants to tell you something about it, and maybe even tells you something about the value, some kind of restriction on the value. So there's two different naming conventions that you can use when it comes to naming variables. You can either name them like this, and where you replace spaces with an underscore. That's totally fine. Or you could do them like this. Now this is how I do my variables. It just it's a really common convention throughout programming to capitalize the first letter of each word that's not the first one. So for example, I could even call this "my name is Alex," and that would be an acceptable variable name. Remember, you cannot have any spaces, you cannot have capital letters in the first letter, or you cannot have any kind of special characters like commas or exclamation marks or things like that. So just letters and no spaces. All right, but both of these would be acceptable. So making variables interact. So remember, variables can be used once they've been assigned the values. Like numbers, in this case we have two integer variables. You can just add them up. You can actually make them interact using operators, and that's what the next video will be about. But remember that once you assign a value to a variable, it becomes that value. So by adding x and y right here, we are actually adding the values of those variables. So the answer to this would actually print out the number 11. Okay. Now, if I were to put quotations around these, this is important. If I were to put quotations around these are now strings. So you're adding the value of those variables, which is the string 5 and the string 6. So instead, you would get the string 56 would print out to the console. Now remember, this is not a number right now. If we added these two values, this is no longer a number. It is a string of 56. All right, so it's very different. So a very useful way of assigning variables is to actually use the input function. So we've talked about this a little bit this year. This is how, hey, I want to take the name of a variable, and I want my user who is using my program to define what its value is. So one way that you can do this is by asking them, hey, what is your name? And this would come back as a string type variable. Now, one of the things about the input function is that you must specify if you want an integer from the user. So for example, with your age, if you just put your age and you got rid of this, all right, and then we got rid of this one, hold on one second, and we got rid of this one. If you just did that, they're gonna send you back, oh, I'm 8 years old, right? But the problem is that is now a string, so you won't be able to use that in any kind of calculation. So make sure that if you want an integer from your user, you have to specify, okay, I want this to be an integer type variable. And it would be the same thing with floats. The string is the only one that's going to be default for the inputs. All right, so that's how you use variables. Remember, here are your variable types. It's very useful. It's always a good practice to put everything into variables first. Remember, this is the first step whenever you're creating a new program. Define the variables first. All right, so think about all the different moving parts you're going to have in your program and assign them to a variable. I hope that this clears up some of the questions you had about variables and variable types. The next video will be about operators, so I'll see you then. Thanks.